Okay, let's get into it. When you think about what goes down the drain, well, it's more than just wastewater, right? It carries this hidden story about us, our health, our habits, and yes, even the substances flowing through our communities. Today, we're really plunging into some fascinating data on this, focusing on drug use in a major city, Taipei.
It's fascinating, the method being used here. Wastewater-based epidemiology, WBE. It's quite revealing. It kind of sidesteps the usual issues with surveys, potential bias, or relying on individual tests, which only show a tiny part of the picture.
Right, surveys can be tricky. People might not be entirely honest or might not even know.
Exactly. WBE looks at the collective output, the wastewater itself. It's broader, more objective in a way, almost like a real-time anonymous health check for the whole city.
A health check, I like that. And that brings us right to this deep dive. We've got a study published in the Journal of Hazardous Materials. It looks really closely at wastewater samples from Taipei, specifically from 4 treatment plants. And the time frame is key here, September 2021 through to January 2024.
Yeah, that period is so important because it covers the tail end of the really intense COVID-19 restrictions and then the transition back towards, well, normalcy.
So we get to see potential shifts.
Precisely. And the scale is impressive. They weren't just looking for 1 or 2 things. They tracked 38 conventional drugs plus 30 new psychoactive substances, NPS.
30 MPS.
Wow. Yeah. And these daily samples from those 4 plants cover about 6 million people in the Taipei metro area. Huge population. To actually find these drugs, they used a very sophisticated technique. Liquid chromatography tandem mass spectrometry, LC-MSMS.
Sounds complex, like a high-tech filter.
Sort of. Think of it as being able to find a specific grain of sand on a beach. It can identify and measure really tiny amounts of these substances, even when they're mixed in with everything else in the wastewater.
Okay, got it. So our mission for you, the listener, today is to unpack these drug use trends in Taipei during this really unique time of disruption. We want to pull out the surprising finds from this wastewater data and think about what it all means for public health, for policy.
So yeah, just to recap the scope, 38 conventional drugs, 30 MPS, Taipei, September 21 to January 24, during and after COVID peaks. 4 treatment plants, 6 million people covered, and that sensitive LC-MSMS detection. It's a solid setup.
Definitely. So digging into the findings, what were some of the maybe unexpected things that this analysis turned up?
Well, one of the really notable things was detecting certain NPS that hadn't actually been reported in Taiwanese sewage before this study. Specifically, they found tramadol, sulfidem tartrate that's often in sleeping pills,
right,
and also substances called CMA and MDPV. These were newly detected.
And were these just trace amounts or showing up frequently?
That varied. The detection frequency ranged quite a bit, from about 1.4% for some up to, interestingly, 89% for others across the samples taken. So definitely making their presence known.
89%. That's quite high for a newly detected substance. Okay, so new players on the scene. What about the more established drugs, the hard drugs, so to speak?
Yeah, that's another key finding. Methamphetamine. Its presence was incredibly consistent. It showed up in 100% of the wastewater samples. Right. Throughout the entire study period.
100%, so every day, essentially.
Pretty much. It points towards really persistent daily use in the community. And remarkably, this didn't seem to stop, even with all the COVID-19 restrictions in place at various times.
It's quite something. Shows real resilience in its use, I guess. Now, the study deliberately looked at the COVID restrictions and reopenings. What did the wastewater tell us about that impact?
This is where you see some really interesting dynamics. Taiwan had different phases, right? Level 3 restrictions, which were quite strict on businesses and gatherings, then easing to level 2. Later, nightclubs reopened. Quarantine rules changed. Then there was a major outbreak, and eventually a return to something more like normal life. And the data showed that methamphetamine and morphine levels seemed to dip when restrictions were tighter. But then they rose again around the time nightclubs reopened. It strongly suggests a link between, well, the opportunity to gather socially and the use of those specific drugs.
That makes sense. Fewer parties, maybe less demand or opportunity for party drugs. What about other types of substances? Did they follow the same pattern?
Not entirely. Benzodiazepines, for example, showed a kind of opposite trend compared to those NPS.
Benzos, often used for anxiety.
Exactly. Their levels seemed to increase during the more stressful periods of the pandemic, perhaps when people felt more isolated or anxious. Then, as restrictions eased and life maybe felt a bit less stressful, the benzo levels started to decrease.
Interesting. So potentially reflecting different ways people were coping or different needs at different times.
It certainly looks that way. And methadone showed interesting patterns, too. Its consumption levels seemed to possibly compensate for morphine use at certain points, especially around the time of that major outbreak.
Compensate? How so?
Well, perhaps morphine became harder to get, or maybe there were shifts in opioid treatment approaches during that period. The methadone use might have fluctuated in response.
Okay. And ketamine, other NPS.
Ketamine and other NPS showed trends somewhat similar to meth and morphine, potentially linked to those social gathering opportunities again, but also maybe influenced by supply chain disruptions during the pandemic. Availability might have been unstable.
Right. Supply chains were hit hard everywhere. So availability and social settings both playing a role.
Seems likely. And the study quantified some of this. They found significant increases in the average consumption of meth, morphine, ketamine, those non-ketamine NPS, and even acetaminophen.
Acetaminophen, like Tylenol.
Yeah, likely reflecting more people being sick during the outbreaks, using painkillers. All those increased in the post-COVID period compared to during the pandemic's height.
And conversely,
benzodiazepine and methadone consumption decreased in that post-COVID period.
so a definite shift back as things opened up. Now, you mentioned something earlier that really caught my attention, the lack of a typical weekly pattern. No weekend spike.
Yes, that was quite surprising.
Yeah.
Usually for recreational drugs, you see higher levels in wastewater collected on weekends compared to weekdays, parties, nights out, etc. But this study found no significant difference between weekday and weekend consumption for any of the drugs across the entire study period.
None at all. Why would that be?
The researchers think the COVID measures just disrupted normal life so much. Work from home, restrictions on movement, limited social events. It might have blurred the lines between the work week and the weekend for many people. Their routines changed, and maybe their substance use patterns flattened out as a result.
That's a fascinating insight into how deeply those measures affected daily life. Okay, how does Taipei stack up globally? Did they compare these findings?
They did provide some comparisons, though you always have to be careful comparing different regions. Lots of factors involved.
Sure, culture, laws, economics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But for context, average meth levels in Taipei were lower than reported in Turkey and the U.S., but higher than Iceland or South Korea. Morphine was generally lower than the U.S. and Spain, but higher than in China. Codeine, lower than the U.S., higher than China and Malaysia. And ketamine levels in Taipei were sort of middle of the road compared to other places reporting data. It gives you a sense of perspective.
A rough benchmark. And you mentioned this study was the first to spot certain NPS in Taiwan.
That's right. Tramadol, zolpidem tartrate, CMA, and MDPV, their first detection in Taiwanese wastewater, according to this research. Interestingly, they didn't find methadone, which pops up elsewhere.
Any idea why not?
They suggest it might break down really quickly in the sewage system. So by the time the sample gets to the lab, it might be gone or too degraded to detect easily. Some substances just don't leave a strong trail.
Right. Makes sense. Okay, let's zoom out. Thinking about the bigger picture, what are the main environmental or public health takeaways here?
Well, fundamentally, it highlights just how valuable WBE can be. It's a powerful tool for tracking substance use trends almost in real time across a whole population. This kind of data can directly inform public health strategies. Are prevention efforts working? Are new dangerous substances emerging? WBE can provide clues. And of course, the fact these drugs end up in wastewater does raise environmental questions too. What's the impact on aquatic life downstream? That wasn't the focus here, but it's an implicit consequence.
A sobering reminder of that downstream impact. But like any method, it's not perfect. What limitations did the researchers point out?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They were clear about the limitations. For one, population numbers in a big city like Taipei fluctuate daily commuters, tourists that adds noise to the data.
Right, the number of people contributing isn't perfectly constant.
Exactly. And it's crucial to remember this gives a community-level view. You can't infer individual behaviors from this. Also, while they had many samples, more samples per plant could always strengthen the analysis. The focus was urban, so it might not reflect rural Taiwan.
Makes sense.
And finally, just the inherent analytical uncertainties that come with measuring tiny amounts of complex chemicals in, well, wastewater. It's challenging work.
So it's a powerful snapshot, but still just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Precisely. You need to combine it with other data sources.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. What are the absolute key takeaways from this deep dive into Taipei's wastewater story?
I'd say, 1, the detection of new psychoactive substances entering the scene there. 2, the remarkable persistence of methamphetamine use right through the pandemic. 3, the way different drug types fluctuated differently in response to COVID measures, reflecting maybe social factors or stress levels. And 4, that clear shift in overall consumption patterns as pandemic measures eased off.
It really is amazing how much we can learn from something we usually just flush away without a second thought. This wastewater analysis gives such a unique, data-driven perspective on drug use, a really complex issue.
It absolutely does. It's quite powerful.
And it leaves us with a final thought, maybe for you, the listener, to mull over. We've seen how a massive disruption like the pandemic can reveal hidden patterns in our collective behavior through this kind of analysis. Could wastewater epidemiology become a standard, routine tool for public health? Not just for drugs, but for other health markers too. What other stories might our wastewater be telling us if we just knew how to listen?
It's a fascinating question. A whole new frontier for understanding community health, potentially.